The shadows going in different directions, the numerous things wrong with the flag, the lander didn't dig a crater, you can't see any stars, it was all filmed on a soundstage by Stanley Kubrick. If any of these statements sounds familiar, then odds are you spend way too much time online and need to touch some grass. Ever since Bill Kaysing published his We Never Went to the Moon, America's $30 Billion Swindle in 1976, a small but growing number of dissenters have vehemently argued that neither Neil Armstrong nor anyone else ever stepped foot on the moon. Rather, they argue, the whole Apollo program was nothing more than an elaborate Cold War hoax meant to demonstrate America's technological superiority over the Soviet Union. But as we've already covered in exhaustive detail in our previous video, How Do We Actually Know We Landed on the Moon?, every single one of the popular arguments put forward by Kaysing and individuals in the aftermath has been thoroughly debunked. For some examples we've just listed extremely briefly, the shadows are deflected by terrain, the flag had a metal rod along its top edge to keep it deployed, due to the moon's low gravity, the lunar module descent engine did not need to be powerful enough to dig a crater, and the exposure on the astronauts' cameras was set to photograph the bright lunar surface, meaning the faint stars didn't register on the film, something you can try out for yourself with your own camera here on Earth if you like. Or using your own eyeballs, look at a bright light, and then go outside to look at the stars and see how few you can see at first. Wait a little bit for the eye aperture to adjust, and all of a sudden the stars appear. And while yes, Stanley Kubrick did direct the moon landings, as everyone knows, he was such a perfectionist that he insisted on filming on location. Yet among all the arguments against the feasibility of manned lunar landings, one stands out among the rest, even among regular, non-terminally online people, the Van Allen radiation belts. These regions, located between 640 to 58,000 kilometers or 400 to 36,000 miles above the Earth's surface, are filled with high-energy electrons, protons, and other subatomic particles emitted by the sun and trapped by the Earth's magnetic field. According to conspiracy theorists, the radiation in these belts is too intense for humans to survive, making space travel outside of low Earth orbit impossible. But is it actually true? Have the moon landing conspiracy people finally scored a fatal blow against NASA and the 400,000 or so people who worked on the Apollo missions? Does this one single data point negate the literally hundreds of thousands of other confirmations we have during the Apollo missions and countless more since? Well, no, of course not. But this wouldn't be a very convincing or interesting video if we stopped there. And in truth, it's a great question and has a super interesting answer with a lot of interesting things to learn along the way. So how did the Apollo astronauts survive crossing such a dangerous region of outer space? Well, slip into your spacesuit, pull on your lead-lined underwear, maybe not in that order, unless you want to look like Superman, as we blast off in search of the answer to how the brilliant engineers and scientists working on all of this solved this problem. Just before we get back to how humans survive going through the Van Allen belts, would you like to increase the odds of your surviving going through, well, life as long as possible? Then getting in great shape is statistically a great way to do that, and today's sponsor, Averon, has got you covered in a fun way, utilizing all the psychological tricks that game designers use to keep you gaming and leveling up your digital character, but instead helping you level up yourself in real life. For those unfamiliar, Averon is pioneering fitness entertainment from their award-winning rower and bike to now the world's first gamified treadmill, which also features an industry-leading ultra-low 4-inch impact-absorbing CloudStrike deck. On the gaming front, Averon has hundreds of games built in to eliminate boredom while you level up your strength, endurance, and health points. Otherwise, like doing sitting on the couch things but want to make it productive? How about watching various streaming services from Netflix to YouTube and beyond on their built-in 22-inch screen? You could even learn about the Van Allen belts in this video right now while on a run, leveling up your mind and body in one. Prefer a scenic run that does not include Simon or Mai's face? Averon's got you covered there too, with tons of scenic locations from around the world to enjoy. They've also got on-demand classes, friend or community competitions where you can dominate not just others, but also your past self with their time machine feature. Just something infinitely satisfying about pushing to be able to do something today you could not do yesterday. Bottom line, one of the single most important things you can do for your long-term happiness, quality of life, and possibly even length of life is get in and stay in shape. Averon helps you do that utilizing all manner of psychological tricks to keep you on track with your fitness goals in an enjoyable way. So if leveling up your most important character in yourself is on your goal list, Averon has their best prices of the year on right now, and you can also get an additional $50 off when you use the link in the description below and our code TODAY50. To begin with, the idea that the Earth's magnetic field could trap charged particles actually far predates the space age. In 1895, Norwegian physicist Christian Birkeland was conducting experiments with electron beams, then known as cathode rays, in which he fired such a beam at a powerful magnet inside a vacuum chamber. He discovered that the particles were drawn towards the nearest magnetic pole, spiraling around magnetic lines of force to form a large donut-shaped cloud. He hypothesized, correctly as it turned out, that a similar phenomenon was responsible for the formation of the northern and southern lights, which are most intense at the poles where the Earth's magnetic lines of force converge. Based on Birkeland's findings, French mathematician Henri Poincaré and later Norwegian mathematician Frederick Karl Stormer developed rudimentary mathematical models for such magnetically trapped particles, but neither was able to fully predict their behavior due to its inherently chaotic nature. When, in the 1910s, cosmic rays, charged particles descending from outer space, were discovered by, among others, Austrian-American physicist Victor Hess, Birkeland's observations were found to closely model their behavior as well. At the exact same time, other scientists were trying to work out the physics of geomagnetic storms, disruptions to the Earth's magnetic field caused by coronal mass ejections, or CMEs, giant discharges of plasma from the sun's corona. Such events are extremely hazardous to electronics, both on the Earth's surface and in outer space, meaning it is extraordinarily lucky that the largest CME on record, the Carrington event, occurred all the way back in September of 1859. But while the world's electrical infrastructure at the time was, to say the least, minimal, the Carrington event did induce massive electrical currents in the newly laid transatlantic telegraph cable, sparking numerous fires and even electrocuting telegraph operators at both ends. Further evidence, as ever, that the glowing orb in the sky is bent on our destruction and we should always stay indoors, safely hidden away from its murderous gaze. Closer to the present day, on March 13, 1989, a large geomagnetic storm knocked out the electrical grid in Quebec, Canada for 9 hours and triggered bright aurora as far south as Texas. Thankfully, however, no permanent damage was done, though it is only a matter of time before another massive geomagnetic storm strikes, with potentially dire consequences if you weren't worried about enough things right now. In any case, it was not until 1957 that American physicist Siegfried Singer theorized that the charged particles released by coronal mass ejections could become trapped in belts formed by the Earth's magnetic field, producing the effects observed during geomagnetic storms. His theory was to be confirmed just the following year by the scientist central to our story, James Van Allen. Born on September 7, 1914, on a farm near Mount Pleasant, Iowa, Van Allen initially tried to join the U.S. Navy, but was rejected on account of flat feet, poor eyesight, and his inability to swim. His dreams of glory on the high seas dashed, he instead studied nuclear physics at the Carnegie Institution in Washington, D.C., obtaining his Ph.D. in 1939. During the Second World War, he worked on the National Defense Research Committee, or NDRC, and later the Applied Physics Laboratory, or APL, at Johns Hopkins University on proximity fuses, tiny radar fuses fitted inside artillery shells that allow them to detonate when they pass within a certain distance of their target. One of the greatest technological achievements of the Second World War, alongside the cavity magnetron and the atomic bomb, proximity fuses greatly enhanced the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire and were vital in defending the U.S. Navy Pacific Fleet against Japanese kamikaze attacks in the final months of the conflict. Indeed, in November of 1942, Van Allen was commissioned as a U.S. Navy lieutenant and posted aboard a succession of destroyers to conduct field tests of the fuses and instruct gunnery officers on their use. After the war, Van Allen returned to civilian research at the APL, turning his attention to the study of high-altitude atmospheric and cosmic phenomena. In December of 1947, he was appointed chairman of the V2 Upper Atmosphere Panel, later the Upper Atmosphere Rocket Research Panel. This organization converted captured German V2 ballistic missiles into sounding rockets for upper atmospheric research, launching them from White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. But while dozens of such rockets were launched between 1946 and 1952, returning valuable data and placing both the first living creatures, fruit flies, and the first mammal, a rhesus monkey named Albert II, into space, the converted missiles were unreliable and expensive to build and launch. As a result, Van Allen commissioned the Aerojet Company of Rancho Cordova, California to develop a smaller, cheaper sounding rocket for civilian use. Modified from the pre-existing WAC Corporal and Bumblebee missiles, both developed using U.S. Navy funds, the resulting rocket, dubbed the Aerobee, first flew on March 5, 1948, and quickly became a go-to vehicle for high-altitude research. And to learn more about the fascinating history of sounding rockets, why not check out a whole lecture on the topic over on Our Own Devices, the personal channel of this video's author, the Professor Gilles Messier. In any event, in March of 1949, while on an Aerobee launching cruise aboard the U.S. Navy research vessel USS Norton Sound, Van Allen, along with Fred Singer, Commander Lee Lewis, and Commander G. Halverson, devised a method for making sounding rockets even cheaper by launching them from high-altitude weather balloons, a combination they charmingly dubbed a raccoon. The following year, Van Allen left the APL and accepted a position as head of physics at the University of Iowa. There, along with his students, he developed the first practical raccoons, comprising 3-meter-long Loki-sounding rockets suspended from helium balloons and rigged to launch at an altitude of 16,000 meters or 1,960 Ariana Grandes. While these contraptions worked well, there were widespread concerns that the spent rocket stages would fall onto houses and other structures and inflict damages. So, Van Allen convinced the U.S. Coast Guard to let him launch his raccoons from its icebreaker USCGC Eastwind during a cruise to Greenland. But Greenland is not Iowa, it turns out, and up in the Arctic, Van Allen ran into some unexpected technical difficulties, as Time magazine later reported. The first balloon rose properly to 70,000 feet, but the rocket hanging under it did not fire. The second raccoon behaved in the same maddening way. On the theory that the extreme cold at high altitude might have stopped the clockwork supposed to ignite the rockets, Van Allen heated cans of orange juice, smuggled them into the third raccoon's gondola, and wrapped the whole business in insulation. The rocket fired. Many more launches followed over the next few years, with the rockets being fitted with ionization chambers and Geiger-Müller tubes to detect cosmic radiation. On one 1953 expedition carried out by the Coast Guard icebreaker USCGC Staten Island, these instruments detected a large region of concentrated soft radiation, charged particles, and low-energy X-ray photons at altitudes above 60,000 meters or 200,000 feet. As Van Allen later wrote, the 1953 expedition yielded a remarkable new finding, namely the first direct detection of the electrons which, we surmised, were the primaries for producing auroral luminosity. This was the first hard evidence for the radiation belts that would eventually bear Van Allen's name. That same year, the International Council of Scientific Unions announced the International Geophysical Year, or IGY, an 18-month event planned for the years 1957 and 1958, in which teams of scientists from around the world would collaborate to conduct research on the Earth and its surrounding environment. Interestingly, the idea had originated in James Van Allen's own living room, where on April 5, 1950, a number of scientists, including Fred Singer, Lloyd Berker, Sidney Chapman, and Harry Vestine, met and conceived of an international scientific collaboration in the same vein as the International Polar Years of 1882 to 1883 and 1932 and 1933. Among the many projects proposed for the IGY were various schemes to place an artificial satellite into Earth orbit. Indeed, in 1954, Van Allen was approached by Dr. Wernher von Braun, the former Nazi rocket engineer and later designer of the Saturn V rocket that took astronauts to the moon. What von Braun wanted to talk to him about was Project Orbiter, a then unofficial U.S. Army project to launch a satellite using a modified PMG-11 Redstone ballistic missile. Recognizing the need for a proper scientist on their team, von Braun invited Van Allen to join the project and design the scientific instruments aboard the satellite. But while Van Allen enthusiastically accepted, the following year the U.S. government announced that the country's IGY satellite would instead be launched by the Navy's Project Vanguard rocket. But of course, Project Orbiter and Project Vanguard were both beaten to the punch when, on October 4th, 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite, into orbit. Sputnik 1 was a very basic craft consisting of a hollow, 58-centimeter or 23-inch diameter nitrogen pressurized steel sphere containing silver zinc batteries and 2 radio transmitters broadcasting at 20 and 40 megahertz and containing 4 whip antennas. While it is often stated that the satellite simply transmitted a meaningless series of rhythmic beeps, this is not exactly true. Encoded in the beeps was data about the pressure inside the sphere, allowing Soviet engineers to monitor the craft's hull integrity. Otherwise, however, the satellite carried no scientific instruments. A team of Soviet science, led by Sergei Vernov of Moscow State University, had actually conceived of a much more sophisticated satellite, Object D, fitted with a suite of scientific instruments. But this craft proved much heavier and took longer to develop than anticipated. Determined to orbit a satellite before the Americans, Sergei Korolev, chief designer of the Soviet space program, thus opted for the more stripped-down Sputnik design for the first launch. But just 1 month later, Vernov and his team got a second chance when, on November the 3rd, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2 into orbit. In addition to a pressurized cabin for the dog Laika, the first animal to orbit the Earth, Sputnik 2 also carried a number of scientific instruments, including gas discharge tubes for measuring cosmic rays and solar X-rays. Initially, however, these instruments were thought to be faulty since the detectors were saturated with intense radiation no matter which direction they were pointed. Little did Vernov and his team realize, but their instruments had actually detected one of the Earth's radiation belts. Other factors also prevented the Soviets from making this key breakthrough. As theorists like Christian Birkeland had predicted and experimentalists like Van Allen had observed, this trapped radiation was most concentrated near the polar regions. However, telemetry could only be received from Sputnik 2 while the satellite was over Soviet territory, meaning these radiation spikes were not observed by Soviet scientists. And while Australian scientist Harry Messel did intercept and record the satellite signals as it passed over the South Pole, the Soviets flatly refused to share the codes needed to interpret the data. And when the Soviets asked for the intercepted data, unsurprisingly, he told them to go to hell as only Harry Messel could. Thus, were it not for Cold War secrecy and paranoia, the Van Allen belts may very well have been dubbed the Vernov belts. Meanwhile, the nascent U.S. space program got off to an embarrassing start when, on December 6, 1957, the Vanguard rocket blew up on the launch pad at Cape Canaveral, Florida. Thankfully, however, von Braun and his Project Orbiter team had anticipated this and set aside a modified Redstone rocket in case the Navy project faltered. Following the launch of Sputnik 2, Secretary of Defense Neil McElroy ordered von Braun to pull the rocket, dubbed Juno 1, out of storage and prepare it for launch. And so it was that on January 31st, 1958, 2 months after the Vanguard TV-3 disaster, Juno 1 roared off the launch pad, carrying America's first satellite, Explorer 1, into orbit. Measuring 203 centimeters, or 80 inches long, and 15 centimeters, or 6 inches in diameter, Explorer 1 carried a suite of scientific instruments designed by James Van Allen himself, including 5 temperature sensors, an acoustic and grid detector for registering micrometeor impacts, and an omnidirectional Geiger-Müller tube for detecting cosmic radiation. Curiously, the latter did not detect any radiation at all, even in regions where Van Allen had predicted the flux would be high. But instead of assuming, like the Soviets, that the instrument was faulty, Van Allen instead surmised that the tube was actually saturated by intense radiation trapped in the Earth's magnetic field. This finding confirmed the existence of the radiation belts first detected by his raccoons 5 years before. 2 months later, in late March of 1958, the nearly identical Explorer 3 satellite returned identical results, confirming that Explorer 1's data had not been faulty. However, neither satellite's detector tubes could determine the nature of the radiation being detected. It was not until May 15, 1958, when the Soviets launched Sputnik 3, that these mysteries started to be revealed. The final form of Object D, the design originally intended to be the world's first satellite, Sputnik 3 carried a more sophisticated radiation detector called the scintillation counter, consisting of a thallium-doped silver iodide crystal attached to a photomultiplier tube. When particles impacted this crystal, they produced tiny flashes of light, which were amplified and converted into detectable signals by the photomultiplier tube. Sputnik 3 determined that in the polar regions, the Van Allen belts were largely composed of protons with energies around 100 mega-electron volts, while in equatorial regions, they contained mostly electrons with energies of around 100 kilo-electron volts. Most of the lower energy protons and electrons in the outer belt are produced directly by solar fusion processes, while the higher energy protons in the inner belt derive largely from unstable, high-speed neutrons decaying into protons and neutrinos en route. And speaking of unstable things, your life when you're not subscribed to this channel. If you're enjoying this video, why not hit subscribe? Subscribing to Today I Found Out is scientifically proven to make your life better and all your hopes and dreams come true, according to the words that just came out of my mouth. But in any event, on July the 26th, 1958, Van Allen's team launched Explorer 4 into orbit. Equipped with 2 scintillation counters, as well as a Geiger-Müller tube, Explorer 4 was designed to more thoroughly map the Van Allen belt. Indeed, the satellite discovered that there was not one Van Allen belt, but 2 nested one inside the other. Today we know that the 2 belts are shaped like hollow donuts or toruses extending perpendicular to the axis of the Earth's magnetic field. The size of the belts vary widely depending on the intensity of the solar wind, with the inner belt starting at an altitude of between 600 and 1600 kilometers, or 375 to 1,000 miles, and extending out to between 9,600 and 13,000 kilometers, or 6,000 to 8,125 miles. The outer belt, meanwhile, begins at between 13,500 to 19,000 kilometers, or 8,437 to 11,875 miles, and extends out to around 40,000 kilometers, or 25,000 miles. The gap between the belts is known as the slot region and is normally devoid of charged particles. However, during a particularly powerful solar storm or coronal mass ejection, electrons from the outer belt can migrate into the slot region, producing a third transient Van Allen belt. And in addition to the Van Allen belts, the Earth also sports a structure known as the plasmasphere, a cloud of electrons traveling at relativistic, that is, near light speeds along the magnetic lines of force. Extending from around 1,000 kilometers or 625 miles to 14,000 kilometers or 8,750 miles, that is, just inside and pushing slightly out of the slot region, the plasmasphere emits a constant 10 kilohertz radio signal known as the plasmapheric hiss. The intensity of the radiation in the Van Allen belts varies widely depending on position and solar activity, with electrons reaching energies of 1.5 mega-electron volts, powerful enough to penetrate 0.25 millimeters or 0.1 inches of aluminum, and protons up to 400 mega-electron volts, enough to penetrate a whopping 143 millimeters or 5.6 inches of lead. The flux or density of this radiation also varies, reaching as high as 1 million particles per square centimeter per second. While the conversion process is not exact, this roughly translates to a maximum dose rate of around 0.06 grays, i.e. joules of energy deposited per kilogram of matter per second. Now, the effects of ionizing radiation on living tissue depend on 2 primary factors: the type of radiation and the type of tissue it is absorbed by, each of which must be corrected by applying the appropriate weighing factor to our dose rate in grays. For example, while X-rays, gamma rays, and beta particles, i.e. electrons, have a correction factor of 1, protons deposit twice as much energy and thus have a weighing factor of 2, while alpha particles have an enormous correction factor of 20. Meanwhile, different tissues react differently to radiation. For example, while the skin and brain are relatively insensitive and have weighing factors of only 0.01, fast-growing tissues like the bone marrow, gonads, and stomach lining are far more sensitive and have weighing factors of up to 0.2. Indeed, this is why severe high radiation doses can inflict genetic damage leading to birth defects as well as bone cancers like leukemia, and why one of the first symptoms of acute radiation syndrome, aka radiation sickness, is vomiting as the stomach lining breaks down. So, applying the weighing factors for protons and bone marrow yields an equivalent dose rate of around 52 sieverts per hour. Given that the maximum cumulative radiation dose for a NASA astronaut is only 1 sievert over their entire career, and that an acute dose of 4 to 5 sieverts is enough to kill a grown man within 30 days with a 50% probability, it should come as no surprise that this is an incredibly high dose rate, and that an unprotected astronaut traveling through the most high flux regions of the Van Allen belts would absorb a lethal radiation dose within minutes. Indeed, in 1959, James Van Allen himself wrote in Scientific American that, so far, the most interesting and least expected result of the men's exploration of the immediate vicinity of the Earth is the discovery that there are regions of high-energy radiation extending many thousands of miles into space. The discovery is, of course, troubling to astronauts. Somehow, the human body will have to be shielded from this radiation, even on a rapid transit through the region. But while early manned space flights took place in low Earth orbit at altitudes below 2,000 kilometers or 1,250 miles, NASA was planning on sending astronauts to the moon as part of Project Apollo, missions that would require flying through the potentially lethal Van Allen radiation belts. The first formal discussion of this potential show-stopping hazard took place during a meeting of NASA's Space Task Group in the summer of 1960. During this meeting, researchers Robert O. Pilland and Stanley C. White argued that while no amount of practical shielding could protect astronauts from the intense radiation of the inner Van Allen belt, a moderate amount of aluminum shielding could offer adequate protection against the less intense outer belt, at least for the brief period it would take the spacecraft to cross said belt. In 1962, however, James Van Allen suggested a more radical solution: get rid of the belts altogether. And just how did he propose to accomplish such a feat? Well, with nuclear bombs, of course. According to Van Allen's plan, setting off a nuclear weapon near the outer belt would give the particles within enough extra energy to escape their magnetic confinement, causing the belt to dissipate. That same year, Van Allen's theory was tested during Operation Fishbowl, a series of 5 high-altitude nuclear tests conducted at Johnston Atoll in the Pacific Proving Grounds. The tests were intended to study the effects of high-altitude nuclear detonations on the upper atmosphere and, in turn, how this would affect radio communications and other equipment. Scientists also wanted to test the feasibility of creating an artificial radiation belt around the Earth as a possible defense against incoming intercontinental ballistic missiles. The first and largest test of the series, Starfish Prime, was conducted on July 8, 1962, with a 1.4 megaton warhead being lofted to an altitude of 400 kilometers or 250 miles by a PGM-17 Thor Intermediate Range Ballistic Missile, or IRBM. The results were dramatic. Not only did the flash and auroras produced by the detonation light up large areas of the South Pacific for several minutes, but the resulting electromagnetic pulse wreaked havoc in Hawaii, 1,500 kilometers or 900 miles away, knocking out hundreds of streetlights and damaging a telephone microwave link. Worse still, rather than dissipating the Van Allen belts, as James Van Allen had predicted, the detonation supercharged them, with the resulting artificial radiation belt damaging and ultimately knocking out several satellites, including the American Track, Transit 4B, Engine 1, and Telstar 1, the world's first commercial communications satellite, the Russian Cosmos B, and Ariel 1, Britain's first domestically produced satellite that had just been put up there. In the wake of Starfish Prime and other high-altitude nuclear tests, it became clear that the Van Allen belts weren't going anywhere anytime soon. However, by this time, the structure and energy distribution of the belts was far better understood, and the radiation hazard to the Apollo astronauts went from a deal-breaking obstacle to a solvable one via engineering and science. Knowing that the inner belt was more dangerous than the outer, and that the electrons under 1 mega-electron volt and protons below 10 mega-electron volts were unlikely to be dangerous, NASA adopted 3 main strategies to protect its astronauts from the Van Allen belts: shielding, trajectory, and speed. While for weight-saving reasons the Apollo spacecraft had to be made from lightweight materials like aluminum, when designing the layout of the cabin, engineers at North American Aircraft, the primary contractor for the Command Service Module, placed as much as possible heavy equipment like instrument panels and drinking water tanks between the astronauts and the hull in order to block out incoming radiation. This provided a radiation attenuation factor of around 10, equivalent to 7 millimeters or a quarter inch of lead shielding. But even this could not guarantee the astronauts' safety, so NASA's primary solution to the radiation problem was a surprisingly straightforward one: simply avoid the Van Allen belts altogether. As such, nearly all Apollo missions adopted a translunar injection, or TLI trajectory, that took them up and over the inner belt and through the outer fringes of the outer belt. And such was the spacecraft's enormous speed, 40,000 kilometers per hour or 25,000 miles per hour, that it passed through these outer regions of the belt in only a few hours, minimizing the crew's radiation exposure. Nonetheless, NASA developed extensive emergency procedures to deal with contingencies like solar storms and issued all of its astronauts with personal passive radiation dosimeters to continuously monitor their radiation exposure. So how did it all work out in the end, all combined? The first human beings to pass through the Van Allen radiation belts were the crew of Apollo 8, who flew around the moon and back between December the 21st and 27th of 1968. When they returned to Earth, their personal dosimeters registered a cumulative radiation dose of only 1.6 milligrays, or 16 microsieverts, equivalent to a single chest X-ray. The crew of Apollo 11, which made the first manned moon landing on July the 20th, 1969, received a similar dose of around 1.8 milligray, or 18 microsieverts. On this one, special care was taken when planning Apollo 11's trajectory to minimize the crew's radiation exposure, with the spacecraft passing through the fringes of the outer Van Allen belt, where the radiation intensity was around 1.67 millisieverts per second in only 90 minutes. Despite their mission being longer, all subsequent Apollo crews received similarly low doses, which significantly were roughly equivalent to those received during missions restricted to low Earth orbit. There was, however, one major exception. Due to the high altitude of its landing site in the Frau Maro Highlands, Apollo 14, which blasted off on January 31st, 1971, could not take the usual over-the-top TLI trajectory and was forced to fly directly through the inner Van Allen belt. This significantly increased their exposure, but the cumulative strategies here still worked, and each astronaut received only a total dose of 11.4 millirems or 114 microsieverts, well below the 5 rem or 50 millisievert year dose limit set by the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, today the Department of Energy, for radiation workers. Indeed, the majority of the astronauts' cumulative doses came not from the Van Allen belts, but rather solar radiation. And even then, natural factors conspired to significantly reduce their risk. For approximately 5 days per orbit, the moon lies within the Earth's geomagnetic tail, i.e. its wake, which is largely free of particles from the solar wind, while for a further 5 days it lies within the magnetosheath, the space between the magnetosphere's outer boundary, or magnetopause, and its bow shock. Here, radiation flux is significantly reduced compared to elsewhere in the magnetosphere. Interestingly, much of this data was collected by a solar wind spectrometer left on the lunar surface by Apollo 12 in November of 1969. This was part of a larger suite of scientific instruments known as the Apollo Lunar Surface Experiments Package, or ALSEP. The astronauts were also extremely lucky in another way. The Apollo program coincided with the peak of the 11-year solar cycle, when solar flares and coronal mass ejections are at their most frequent and intense. But as the entire Apollo program was built around the goal of landing a man on the moon by the end of the decade and before the Soviets, NASA could not afford to wait for the cycle to die down, and thus took the calculated risk of launching the lunar missions despite the increased solar activity. And while none of the 9 Apollo missions that visited the moon between 1968 and 1972 encountered any dangerous solar activity, they came perilously close. On August 4, 1972, halfway between the flights of Apollo 16 and 17, a major geomagnetic storm struck the Earth, damaging satellites, electrical grids, and telecommunications systems around the world, and even caused dozens of U.S. Navy mines off the coast of Haiphong, Vietnam, to accidentally detonate. Had an Apollo mission been flown during this period, the crew would likely have been exposed to lethal levels of solar radiation. This close shave aside, in more recent years, NASA has determined that it greatly overestimated the radiation intensity in the Van Allen belts, especially in the medium to high Earth orbit regions. As a result, it expended more money and payload than necessary to shield satellites from cosmic radiation. Much of this new data was collected between 2012 and 2019 by NASA's twin radiation belt storm probes, later renamed the Van Allen probes after James Van Allen, who died on August 9, 2006 at the age of 91. Nonetheless, in order to maximize the life of their equipment, spacecraft operators still try as much as possible to avoid the damaging Van Allen belts. For example, geosynchronous communication satellites orbit at altitudes of around 36,000 kilometers, or 22,000 miles, which is just inside the outer edge of the outer belt, while both crewed and uncrewed spacecraft in low Earth orbit fly at altitudes below 600 kilometers, the inner boundary of the inner belt. And while solar radiation outside the Van Allen belts posed little threat to the Apollo astronauts during their relatively brief missions, it will be a much greater danger to crews flying longer missions to Mars and beyond, one of thousands of complex problems the wizards at NASA and other space agencies must contend with in their bid to take mankind to the stars. But in conclusion, while the Van Allen belts were certainly a major obstacle for the Apollo missions, they, like all the many thousands of other potential issues, were not an insurmountable one with enough expertise and brainpower thrown at the problem. And through a combination of careful spacecraft design, even more careful mission planning, and sheer glorious speed, NASA succeeded in minimizing the danger in landing human beings on another world. And as for all the other commonly brought up objections with regards to landing on the moon, do go check out our video, How Do We Actually Know We Landed on the Moon?